Advocate Shamila Batohi has been appointed National Director of Public Prosecutions. Batohi has been a legal advisor at the International Criminal Court. She was evidence leader during the King Commission that investigated match fixing in cricket. To discuss the appointment is Lawson Naidoo from the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution, who joins us from our Cape Town studios. And here in Johannesburg, we're joined by Nicole Fritz from Freedom Under Law. Kath?
All right. In fact, let's kick it off with you, Nicole. Your initial impressions as the President has announced Advocate Shamila Batohi as the NDPP?
Well, I think she looks like she's eminently qualified. We know that she's had prosecutorial experience here in South Africa. She was a senior prosecutor. She spent several years as a legal advisor before the International Criminal Court. That's an institution that hasn't necessarily been riven by the type of factionalism we see having affected the National Prosecuting Authority, but it is an institution that has received huge amounts of criticism and public scrutiny, and I think being able to navigate that terrain is going to serve her well in this position.
Lawson, she of course also has a history within the National Director of Prosecutions, having headed up the region in KZN before leaving to the ICC. How far removed do you think that would place her in terms of the current factional battles that exist within the NPA, if it removes her from it at all?
Well, I think, she's been away from the NPA for almost 10 years now. I think what was clear, and it came out in an interview, is that she is very aware of the challenges that confront the prosecuting authority, and she has a very clear idea of what needs to be done in order to fix that institution. So I think she comes in with her eyes wide open. She knows the challenges. She knows how big the job is, and I think that was evident from her remarks after the announcement of her appointment today, that she's certainly up for the fight.
And certainly, these are sentiments that have been shared with previous appointments of directors of the National Prosecuting Authority, and yet we still have this perspective of it being this poison chalice because they just can't finish their term. Nicole, what would she need to do differently from her predecessors in order to change that legacy and, in fact, remain in that position long enough to make tangible change?
I think it's not so much what she needs to do. I think she has to have an executive that understands their role, that they can't be seen to be interfering with her task, her duties, that it is of utmost importance that her office be respected as an independent one. And I think what we've seen in the past, unfortunately, is too much interference from the executive. So ultimately, what is going to be the best security for her tenure, for the stability of the institution, is an executive that doesn't seek to make incursions on the National Prosecuting Authority.
Lawson, how realistic an expectation is that in terms of the interference that we have seen at the NPA? Because in as much as it's not always explicit, in some ways it can very much be implicit, and there's always a balancing act there, isn't there?
Well, there always is, and I think one of the key things that Advocate Batohi has to do is to set out the ground rules of her relationship with the Minister of Justice in particular. Because the Constitution says that the Minister of Justice has final responsibility over the NPA. But it's quite clear that that cannot intrude on the operational and prosecutorial independence of the NPA, and she must be allowed to do her job with sufficient political support from the executive, but to leave her to lead the NPA and allow that institution to do what the Constitution requires it to do.
All right. When she steps into that office, February, as she takes on this position, top 5 things on her desk that she'll need to attend to.
Wow. I mean, we know that the task ahead of her is a mammoth one, and that the National Prosecuting Authority has been riven by instability, by faction fighting. I think she's going to need to try and, ensure that there's a coalescing of unity and support. That she's going to need to retain staff with the requisite skills and independence to do the forensic investigative prosecutorial work that needs to be done. I think she's going to need to respond, and we saw that in her comments today, to the average South African's perception, to respond to their concerns around criminality. So I think what we're going to want to see is building, and that's not going to come immediately, but building of watertight cases that respond to concerns. And some of those concerns relate to state capture. Some of those concerns relate to sort of day-to-day criminality that South Africans are experiencing in their community. I think we're also looking at sort of long-term criminality that hasn't been addressed, stemming from the apartheid era. So I think that there's going to have to be an identification and a setting of resources to identify those crimes that are obviously of enormous concern to South Africans across the board. So it is state capture, but it's wider than state capture, absolutely.
And Lawson, one of the things that we've also heard about the NPA and, the current crisis it's in was the hollowing out, as it were, of good officials and credible officials, as Nicole has put it, who were driven out of that organization. That being the case, and of course there are still very good men and women who remain within the NPA, but are you anticipating that there may be a level of pushback from those perhaps who just don't support her appointment?
Well, I think it's quite clear that there's a pro-Zuma faction that still exists within the NPA, and that's going to have to be dealt with, and that's going to be a difficult process. But I think there are enough right-minded people within the prosecuting authority who really just want to get on with doing their job as prosecutors and need a leadership that supports them in doing that. And I hope that Advocate Batohi will bring that to the table to really empower prosecutors, raise staff morale at the prosecuting authority, and it is through that process of delivering justice to the victims of crime that we will see a restoration of public confidence in the institution, which is ultimately what we need in order to strengthen the rule of law.
But Lawson, is it still useful for us to look at things through the prism of pro-Zuma and anti-Zuma in this instance? Because there is a risk, of course, that should those that are seen to be pro-Zuma be taken out of the system, it could be seen as a purge and that they're being targeted because of whatever positions they may have held in the past.
Well, whatever positions they may have had in the past were positions that were contrary to the constitutional mandate of the NPA, which is to prosecute without fear, favour or prejudice. We know from various court judgments that the NPA stoutly defended former President Zuma when he was challenging, when he was resisting the reinstitution of fraud and corruption charges against him. And Advocate Sean Abrams, the former NDPP, was firmly on the side of Jacob Zuma in that matter. Those are things that need to come to an end, and that the prosecuting authority really needs to step up and identify the key issues it needs to tackle without paying attention to the political influence that may be there, whether it's explicit or implicit.
And of course, Nicole, there's also, I think, pressure on some level for Advocate Batohi, in the sense that when it comes to politics, whatever decisions she makes may, of course, be looked at or be analyzed through the strategies of different political parties and who it benefits and who it doesn't benefit. Going forward, if we are to truly have a clean slate, how do we need to start approaching even our own view of how we look at how the Office of the NDPP deals with these cases?
Well, I mean, I think as Lawson has already said, I mean, the standard that we're assessing against is, are these prosecutions undertaken without fear or favour? And that's a sort of constitutionally mandated criteria. And that means that, persons who have enjoyed power, who continue to exercise power, should not be exempt from the scrutiny of the National Prosecuting Authority and from investigation and prosecution. I think that there has been of late, I mean, in recent years, a concerted effort to use the resources within the National Prosecuting Authority to protect and to prevent investigations and prosecutions from proceeding against the former President Zuma. So that is a concern, but you're right to say that it's not, that's not the only standard, that when we evaluate and measure against without fear or favour, that that might be corrupted in different ways. But we certainly need to be alive to the fact that there will remain persons who have been put in their positions and promoted in order to provide that protection.
Yeah. Because those cracks have certainly not just affected the high-profile cases, but they've also affected how operations are run on the day-to-day and what becomes of NPA cases on the ground. Lawson, perhaps final comments from you going forward in terms of your own expectations. What are perhaps the three key things that you are going to be looking at going forward as Advocate Batohi exercises herself in this position?
Well, as I say, I mean, I think the key issue is about restoring public confidence in the NPA, in being able to carry out its duties, to restore staff morale, and in the way that the NPA reaches out to other sectors of society, because she's going to need the support of ordinary South Africans, of civil society organizations, to enable the NPA to really achieve the mandate that it has for itself. But she can't do it on her own. Her appointment alone is not going to fix the NPA. There's going to have to be a concerted effort by all South Africans to support the initiatives that she puts in place to ensure that ultimately they live up to the constitutional mandate. That's really what we want to see, because if they do that, there'll be no question of measuring issues on a political scale as to whether one faction or the other is benefiting, but it'll be purely decisions taken on the basis of solid evidence that is granted or garnered and an effective prosecution process.
And it certainly is an incredible amount of pressure to place on a singular individual. It's going to take time for her to get anything done, Nicole. So realistically, how long would it take for her to be able to sink her teeth into that institution long enough for there to be change that South Africans can begin to see?
Well, look, I think she's going to have to be cautious. I mean, we don't want to see, you know, the type of thing that we've seen with the Estina Dairy prosecutions, instituted, then withdrawn. But, I mean, as we've already indicated, there are good professional people within the National Prosecuting Authority who have probably been doing their work conscientiously, and there will be cases, you know, ready to flight. So I think we will need to give her some period to adjust herself to the National Prosecuting Authority and put in place her own conception of what a unified National Prosecuting Authority is going to look like. But I think that there is work being done at the present time that will be ready to you know, sort of be profiled once she steps into office.
And just before I let you go, Nicole, one of the things that she mentioned today was that it was a big day for women too, given the fact that she's the first female National Director of Public Prosecutions.
So she is the first permanent head of the National Prosecuting Authority. Obviously, we saw Nicole Fritz serving as in an acting capacity for some time. You know, Freedom Under Law would take the position that that was not particularly historic for justice in South Africa or for women. But I think we now have a candidate who is eminently qualified. I think she is as well placed as any to meet this challenge. And I certainly think it would be wonderful if we could see the restoration of integrity and confidence to the National Prosecuting Authority under a woman.
All right. Let me thank you both, rather. Let me thank you both for your time. Lawson Naidoo, thank you so much. He's with CASIC. And, of course, Nicole Fritz from Freedom Under Law.